The jury is one of those institutions which we have no clear origin for. In the words of English legal scholars, it has existed time immemorial, or beyond the written record. It was not the original form of fact-finding in the common law, but slowly rose to be the sole form over hundreds of years. Before the jury rose to prominence, there were two primary forms of proof used in criminal courts. The first of these was reserved for male nobles accused of a felony, and was trial by battle. In this method, the accused would elect trial by battle before the court. He would then fast and pray for a day before the battle. The accused would either fight his accuser or their champion. If the accused won, then they would be acquitted and the accuser would be found guilty of false accusation and fined. If the accused lost, then they would either be killed in the battle or hung immediately after its conclusion. This method of determining proof declined by the 15th century, although it was technically not outlawed until the 19th century. For the common person and women, battle was not an option. Instead, they would be subjected to trial by ordeal. It was usually left to the judge to determine the method of ordeal, the two most common being trial by cold water or hot iron. The theory behind this method was that God would intervene and give a determination of guilt. Because of the religious overtones of this method, priests would be engaged in the trial proceedings to pray over the accused. Contrary to popular belief, neither of these methods was intentionally designed to result in the death of the accused. Indeed, court records indicate that inclement weather often delayed ordeals for fear of harming the accused. In the ordeal of cold water, the accused would be bound with a knot tied on a rope just above their hair. They would then be tossed into a body of fresh water. If they sank to the knot, then they were deemed to be innocent, as they were accepted by the water and quickly pulled out. If they did not sink, they were deemed to be guilty and punished according to the crime committed. In the ordeal of hot iron, the accused would be required to pick up a piece of hot iron, which would burn their hand. 2 weeks later, the wound would be examined by the judge. If it was healing, then they were deemed innocent, but if it was festering, they were deemed guilty. As both these methods involve some subject judgment call on the part of the judge, it has been suggested that prior knowledge of the crime would bias the outcome. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council forbid priests from participating in ordeals. This caused a crisis in England as it removed the primary mode of determining guilt in criminal trials. In England, the jury had continued to exist alongside these other methods of determining proof, but was most often used to determine property disputes, as it was an excellent method to gather the knowledge of the local community. The English therefore turned to this existing method of proof in criminal trials. The survival of compurgation, or trial by oath swearing for misdemeanors and some felonies into the 17th century, illustrates the initial uncertainty of the jury. It also shows that the jury was not the sole method of determining proof, even once it became the major one. In oath swearing, the defendant and a certain number of oath swearers determined by the judge had to all perfectly recite an oath affirming the accused's innocence. The method was initially effective as the oath swearers were drawn from the local populace, who were likely to know the defendant and therefore unlikely to agree to swear an oath if they believed them to be guilty. This method broke down with the rise of urbanization and, more importantly, paid professional oath swearers. That the jury trial was not a default method of trial is demonstrated by the requirement the defendant had to elect to be tried by a jury when they entered their plea. Because a felony conviction meant that the accused forfeited all titles of nobility and property to the crown, defendants were encouraged to refuse trial by jury. Today, a defendant who stands mute or refuses to plea is treated as if they pled not guilty and tried anyway. However, this is an 18th century development. Until then, the accused were subject to pene forte et dure, or pressing. The accused would be starved and pressed to death with heavy rocks until they entered a plea. This was not considered a form of torture, as the goal was not to gain information from the accused, but to force him to enter a plea, any plea, and therefore be subjected to a trial. Once the defendant opted for a jury trial, then the jurors would be selected. Initially, the jurors had to be male landowners from the locality of the defendant. There were no other consistent limitations, although others have been presented throughout the years. The jury had no set number of persons and no set number needed for conviction. although a majority has always been required. The early juries were expected to be self-informing. That is, they were expected to go into court with knowledge of the defendant, the accusers, and even the facts of the case. This is in direct contrast to American juries today, where the parties seek to ensure that jurors have no prior information about the case. The English colonists brought the jury with them to North America. Early records of Massachusetts Bay and other colonies indicate that juries were in use within a few months of the colonists' arrival. As there were fewer hierarchies in the new colonies, most adult men became eligible for jury duty, although property requirements remained in most colonies. The Constitution of the United States guarantees the right to a jury trial in criminal cases in both Article 3, Section 2, and in the Sixth Amendment. As will be discussed in another presentation, what the right to a jury trial entails has been elaborated on by the Supreme Court in the years since the adoption of the Constitution. The Constitution also ensures the right to a jury trial in most civil cases. However, due to the uncertainties and costs of a jury, many civil cases are tried by judges today.